So probably people who is in late will still arrive until the beginning. So yeah, so I just would like to say hello officially to all of you and thanks for coming. It's really great that you are so many interested in the work we are doing, and I just would like to say some words about the 3C project, because obviously we are like founded, and on this way I would like to say thank you to the European Union as well, that they just invest in circus and they support our work, which is, I think that it's very important work, but sometimes the other part of the world doesn't think that this is that important as we are sure about. So thank you for the Erasmus Plus project. And this project is the 3C Circus project. So if you want to look for more information, you find it on our Facebook page. And the name, the 3C, is standing for three words: circus, competencies, and catalog. And also it refers to three partners, because we are three in this collaboration. Us, the Hungarian Juggling Association, from Italy, there is Circo Tascabile, and from Czech Republic, there is Circaon. And we actually aim to produce different pedagogical tools, such as books and courses, to provide more information about circus in our countries and internationally as well. There is a big announcement for today, because today is the official day when the book of functional juggling, written by Craig Quat, is published. So it's just, yeah, a big a big clap for Craig. I know that it was like a long way to arrive here, and I saw how hard this was to write this book and to really make it on a way, yeah, at that quality how it is now. And I think it's just it is a very high quality work. So in the name of the network as well, I'm just really proud of what is Craig doing for us. I would like to introduce to you then Mr. Craig. So please, Mr. Craig, be nice and start your presentation. Thanks a lot to be with us today.
Okay. Hello. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. So thank you for being here. Thanks you 3C Competency Catalog, Circus Companies Catalog. I'm really excited today. I launched the book. So I'm filled with butterflies. So I want to thank everyone for being here today live with us. I think we have like over 40 people now. And also I love listening and hearing all you guys, because I've met so many of you. Like it's a lot to process right now for me. The publication of this book, and we did a really good job. And I've been traveling and learning a lot and sharing with people, and it's a process that has helped me sort of make a resource that I feel is going to be the most useful for everyone. So like, I really mean it when I say, like, anyone who feels they want to celebrate me for this book should be celebrating themselves as well, because like this whole thing has been such a collective process. So I thank all of you for your curiosities, all of you for your willingness to share with others. I'm feeling very grateful today. So that said, let's start our presentation, shall we? I'm going to switch to screen share. And I have a PowerPoint for you guys today. So for those of you who were not here last time, or I think some of you were, right? I'm also learning, I'm exploring right now different ways to give presentations online and what's going to have the biggest impact. And I think depending on the topic, like, you know, we need to change the style a little bit. So the last seminar, we had some interactive parts where everyone was following along and doing exercises. And then I gave some examples at the end. And that's, you know, more of an organic style. But today it's going to be more just of a presentation. I'm going to present to you the concepts, and I'm going to do it, you know, in a more informal way, giving personal commentary on these ideas. so that as you're reading this material in the book, this presentation will help you better understand it faster. Because we always say that functional juggling it's a learning process that occurs in layers. You know, we need to sort of have experiences with it, reflect on those experiences, and then go deeper. So that it's a learning process that takes multiple exposures. This is a presentation that's in partnership with Circus 3C Circus Competency Catalog, which these guys have already introduced themselves, and I'm super grateful to be working with them. Some class notes, as always with me, it's going to be a lot of information and it's a limited amount of time, but don't worry, I thought about that. This presentation is intended as an overview, not as a training. Like that's the key point. Like I'm trying to give you concepts right now. Like don't try to retain everything. Like let these ideas just sort of hit you and, you know, and feel them out. Understanding occurs in layers and emphasis of its outcome is on the application, not on that of its background. So ultimately, whether or not you understand the theory I explained to you isn't important. What matters is that you can do it. And in a lot of situations, we have great facilitators who they intuitively can process all these ideas, but if you ask them to explain the background, they're not going to do a good job. And that's not important. You know, what's important is that we can share. So don't put so much pressure like on the theory part. Underlying concepts are technical, but applications are intended to be playful. This is very important. Like sometimes people get confused because it is such a technical approach to facilitation that they tend to put it into a box. But the idea is for it to serve as sort of like an organic seed for you guys to create your own explorations. Like it's a jumping off point, and the theory is there so that we can create play. It's not there so that we can create discipline. You know, keep that in mind. And everyone is very much appreciated for being here, especially on this the day of the launch of the book, which I think I'm going to talk more about during the Q&A. But for now, we got a lot of information to go through. What's that? Class notes, class overview. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to break down the sensory facilitation techniques of functional juggling. And by that, we mean all of the nonverbal strategies that we use in order to influence and communicate information to our participants. Because functional juggling facilitation, we try to do nonverbally. And this is a philosophy. We're going to talk about why, and we're going to talk about how. We're also going to talk about the zone of proximal development and how it relates to the stimulation of a flow state. Because juggling produces flow state, and flow state is an alternative state of mind. So anything that causes us to enter an alternative state of mind is something we need to be aware of, to say the least. We're going to do a quick overview of Propswap Notation. Propswap Notation is explained very thoroughly in the book, so you don't need to worry about it here. I'm just going to be introducing the general concept so that I can talk about the primary composition, because the primary composition is what we use to facilitate our introductions. And the primary composition, it's sort of a choreographed facilitation in which we guide our students in a very precise manner of development to get them from point from point A to point B in the most efficient manner. And the outcome of that composition is to exceed the sequencing capacity of a 3-object cascade. That's the goal, because we use it as an introductory tool many times in education, just to expedite, to speed up the learning process, because you can develop in a 10-minute period playing with someone, you can develop all of the sequencing capacities needed. And we're also going to talk about the emotional someone's barking. I hear a barking dog. Is that my dog? That's not my dog. Good. Okay. I do have a dog though, so maybe there might be some barking. And the last thing is emotional self-regulation strategies. Because when we engage in this form of interaction, this nonverbal form of interaction of constantly exchanging objects, obviously we create a rhythm. But there's a lot of sensory information that's being communicated through that rhythm, through that system of play. And it's a form of sensory information that can help us assist other people in the self-regulation of their own emotional processing, because we're creating frequencies. I can communicate more or less intensity with them. And this can help help them regulate their emotions. So those are the topics we're going to be covering today. Some background notes for those of you who were not here in the last class. If you were, it's going to help you. If not, I'm going to overview these topics. If you don't understand them now, when you read the book, it's all explained there. So the first thing we need to review or to be aware of for today is the theory of process formations, which is a matrix-based equation that combines and formulates the total possible outcomes of our binary interactions with space and time. What that means is that there is a limited amount of binary or bilateral binary relationships, because we all have a bilateral nervous system. So the way that we process, it's really important, the difference between which side of my brain is doing the action. And it's the communication. It's sort of a binary thing. It's zeros and ones in terms of communication in the brain. So what the theory of process formation does is it tries to come up with a simplified equation of what the primary relationships are, so that we understand when we teach juggling what relationships we're trying to develop, right? So instead of thinking like, what trick do I want to teach? It's like, no, what relationship with space and time do I want the person to develop? And then confined within the parameters of our bilateral four-dimensional experience, there are only three universal conditions by which all interactions with reality must conform. And this is space, time, and signal. And this has to do with what tasks are required for the brain to process in order to perform any expression of juggling, regardless what the expression is, whether I'm tossing, bouncing, what is the primary relationship, the equation that the brain has to process to perform that task. And these are the three conditions, the only three conditions that matter in every situation. So what we do is we create this chart where we find the different outcomes for each input. So for time, we have synchronous or asynchronous. For space, we have lateral or bilateral. And that's what gives us this matrix that shows us the four possible sequencing relationships with space and time, which is synchronous lateral, synchronous bilateral, asynchronous lateral, and asynchronous bilateral. For synchronous lateral, you can see at the bottom of the slide is a 4-ball fountain. It's columns. Here, none of the information with space needs to be exchanged because the objects are not crossing sides. Whereas in asynchronous lateral, the same is true. The objects don't change sides, so there's less bilateral communication about their movement. But there is more bilateral communication about their timing here, because they need to constantly be aware of where the other side's position is in time in order to process that sequence. So it encourages bilateral communication. And then we have synchronous bilateral, which is very similar to synchronous lateral, but now the objects change sides. So again, the idea is we are identifying the layers of complexity and we're structuring them in order of challenge. And challenge is defined by how many bilateral communication signals are required to perform the task. The last formation is asynchronous bilateral. This is the highest level sequencing task that we have in the theory of process formations, because it requires bilateral communication between the timing of events and the spatial relationships of events. And this is, I always like to point out as being very ironic, because it's so common that the 3-ball tossing cascade is the first trick that we teach, which if you understand the breakdown of the sequencing relationships with space and time, it makes absolutely no sense, because you are starting with the hardest relationship first. It's learning in reverse, which is another reason why juggling is inaccessible, because we don't start at the right place. Another thing I like to say is that if you're not starting synchronous lateral, you're not starting from the beginning. So synchronous lateral is the beginning in terms of processing sequencing tasks, and asynchronous bilateral is the end of that. Understanding this hierarchy is how we build our primary composition. We use that understanding of the theory of process formations to construct the composition that helps the students learn in the most efficient way. The other thing to review is the idea of spatial sequencing maps. So a lot of times people see the juggle board and they think that that is the solution that we came up with. The juggle board is not the solution. The juggle board is a manifestation of the solution. It's an expression of the solution. The solution to making juggling inclusive is spatial sequencing maps. It's identifying 5 points in space that we can interact with and then applying the relationships of the theory of process formations to that map in order to create all the sequencing experiences of juggling. Spatial sequencing maps are intended to indicate where and when our interactions with space will occur, but do not determine anything about the manner in which they must be performed. So all this is doing, this is not so different than there's, I've seen certain structures of dance teaching, you know, they use footsteps and diagrams like this to sort of point out interactions with space. It's another concept like that. You know, it's to give us a way to visualize the learning experience and to structure its model. And most commonly for facilitation, these points are arranged in a horizontal plane, but they're not restricted to that plane. We can put them in any location. The key point is that I need one point in the center and 2 points on either side, so that it allows me to create all the different sequencing relationships of juggling. And this is the expression of that idea. So if I'm playing with the juggle board in the first example, exchanging objects back and forth, then I'm interacting with the x-axis. If I'm moving up and down, I'm interacting the same theory, but on a different axis. If it's horizontal, same theory, different axis, and we can apply these axes in any direction we want. We're not limited to linear, but we introduce it this way because it helps people learn. We start from the bottom and we work our way up. That's my dog this time. Shh. Okay, so that's the review. I'll take a drink. And now we're going to get into the new information. So we're going to start with tactile sensory facilitation techniques. And I like this picture with the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, because between all the senses that we have for communication, the ones that we tend to rely on the most are actually the least reliable: vision and sound. You know, and there's so much scientific evidence to prove how unreliable these sensory processing systems are. They're so easy to distort, and we distort them ourselves so often. But the one sensory input that's sort of the hardest to distort with objectivity, with our subjectivity, is tactile input. And it's the one sensory facilitation that no matter what a person's discapacity is, they have. If you don't have tactile sensation, you're not alive. So we know that this is the one form of sensory communication that's going to be universal to everyone, because not everyone can hear, not everyone can see, not everyone can speak. So the idea in using tactile facilitation techniques as well is to make us accessible to every human being. So sensory facilitation techniques. So I should say that if you have a juggle board right now, I'm going to be talking about different ideas, and you're welcome to apply those while you're watching. And there's going to be videos that demonstrate that. But I'm not going to be stopping the presentation to facilitate those experiences. You're welcome to follow along, because not everyone has the tools with them. So just keep that in mind if you have a board. And maybe I'll point out those moments to you. I'll say, if you have a board, now is a good time to try. So the first thing, the way that we form our basis of communication with our participant is we create what we call a balanced tempo. And whenever facilitating functional juggling, it's very important that we learn to imitate the natural frequencies of our participants' behavior first. And what this means is, when I roll someone a ball, they're going to roll it back to me. And when they roll it back to me, they're going to roll it back to me with a certain force. If I imitate that force back to them, then this creates a distortion with their sensory processing of their own output information. And by that, what I mean is the information that they're putting out is very similar to the information that they're getting back. So I mirror their behavior, I mirror their frequency. And what the intention of that is to trigger mirror neurons in the person's head and to create the basis of our communication style. Because once I harmonize with their frequency, so I'm giving them what they're giving them, then the balls are being exchanged at the same time and with the same force. So what I can then start to do is alter the frequency of that force. I can start to use less force, not a little, just a little bit at a time though, so much that it's unnoticeable to the person consciously, but physically they begin to copy my frequency. And over time, I keep bringing them slower and softer and softer. So somebody who starts to roll me the balls very hard, I can alter their frequency over time by inputting softer information. And if someone was rolling soft, I could change their frequency over time by inputting more intense information. So in creating this system of play, we allow each person to determine or set whatever level of challenge they are most comfortable with from the start, which is also important. By allowing the student to determine how fast these balls are going to roll and when, I know that I'm meeting them where they are. I know that in doing that, they just showed me, I didn't even have to ask them. They presented to me, this is where I am right now. I am here. And I say, okay, I'm going to be with you there too. And we're going to slowly work to be in a different place together. This is a state of interaction in which all of the forces between partners are said to be completely equal. The way that we stimulate this is by harmonizing our sensory inputs with their sensory outputs. We exercise this tempo by releasing and receiving our objects at the same time and with the same amount of force as our participants. Again, a lot of these explanations, the theory of it, when we really break it down, it sounds very complicated, but in the actual application, it's incredibly simple. So this is a demonstration of what I mean by balanced tempo. That's it. It just means we exchange the balls at the same time, they travel the same distance, and we use the same force. That's how I get my participants to begin to communicate with me non-verbally, because now we are exchanging a frequency. We have to, in order for that frequency to exist, it has to be maintained. Uh-oh, my battery is dying. Uh-oh, Jael, 1 second. Wow, that was unexpected. I need something to hold this. Technical problem, very sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna just stand here with my finger on it right now. Okay, so it has to travel the same time, the same distance, and the same force. So in application, it's a very simple concept, no? But it's important to understand how that relationship affects the participant, right? And then what we're able to communicate with this relationship. How much information. So the next thing is to talk about is the facilitator hand positioning. 1 second, we're gonna try something here. Yeah, go over the top. No, oh, this is in the way. Otro lado, de arriba. Sí, perfecta. I am very ghetto. I have an old laptop and an old charger, but it's working now. Sorry for the interruption. Hand positioning. So we know, I just explained to you, the balanced tempo is how we're communicating information to our participant. The way we are receiving information back from them is through our hand positioning, the way that we interact with the objects that they send us. And what we want to do is we want to get the most sensory feedback information ourselves. We want to use a hand positioning that's very relaxed and receptive, so that when the ball contacts my hand, there's absorption, like a little bit, right? Because that's the frequency that then travels up my nervous system to my brain, that my brain processes and then mirrors back. So the more sensory perceptive I can be in receiving the object, the more information I have. Another really important thing is we have to make contact with the object while it's still in motion. If the ball is going into the pocket and the person touches the ball, there's no communication because all the energy has left the ball. So in order for this communication style to work, the contact has to be made while the object is in motion. If the object comes to a stop, the information is gone. It's not gone, it's in the universe, but we can't access it anymore. And here is a video. So this provides the highest level of technical control and also increases the ability of our bodies to process and receive more sensory feedback information from each interaction. In order for this concept to apply, it is necessary that we make contact with each object while it is still in motion. I should say the alternative to this, and what we see a lot in facilitation, especially with beginners, is they don't wait for the ball to stop, they just smack it. So as it's coming towards them, they smack it and it goes back. It achieves the goal, but in this situation, there was no opportunity for the body to receive sensory feedback information about the object. My body put so much energy into it, it wasn't able to receive any energy back. So it's about creating space to receive energy. Sensory facilitation. Okay, flow state stimulation. This is where it gets interesting. As discussed in the previous presentation, our experience of juggling can be defined by the state of mind which it produces, which is global activation. The behaviors of our brain and sensations of our body during a state of global activation are very similar and associated to the experiences of what we would call a flow state. Activation of flow state can be recognized as the instant a person's frequency becomes completely harmonized with the interactions of their environment. And this is something that we detect in our own facilitations through our own tactile sensory perception, through the tactile sense of objects, which help us to paint a picture of the other person's experience. So by receiving this information from our participants, we are being very aware of how they are processing, how they are managing. Because if I'm sending them a frequency of information and they're sending me back something similar, but with a few glitches, meaning like inconsistencies in their rhythm, this is letting me know that the person is not fully processing the frequency of the activity. Their brain is still processing, is learning to sequence this harmonically. So those interruptions in force, those interruptions in time, I'm able to then process and equate to a challenge in processing of information rather than an error of action. I don't see it as a mistake in their action. I see it for what it is, which is a processing error. So the thing, in order to stimulate a flow state, what you have to do is you have to push a person to their highest level of processing capacity. Like we need to push them to the limit of what they're able to do without allowing them to fail. And we need to keep them in that state of experience for as long as we can, because the longer they are in that experience, the more likely we will stimulate a flow state. But in order to understand how to stimulate this flow state, we need to understand the zone of proximal development and how it applies to our educational model. So in order to stimulate flow, it is necessary that we learn to appropriately manage the ZPD, or zone of proximal development, but I'll say ZPD because it's a mouthful, of each participant's experience. ZPD can be thought of as the distance between what a person is able to do now and what they could potentially be able to do next. So it's the learning gap. It's where are they in the learning process? And this is what we mean when we say we create the balanced tempo from the start. We permit the participant to show me from the very beginning exactly where they are. So I mirror their level of challenge. And then as I begin to increase it, I start to challenge their zone of proximal development. So this is the classical model of what the zone of proximal development should look like over time. In a classical learning model, we would expect the outcomes to be linearly progressive. The student progresses a little bit here, I give them another challenge, they progress a little bit more. And what I'm always doing as an educator is I am trying to target the activity that I want my student to do to be at the highest level of their zone of proximal development, to be as close to the limit of their zone of proximal development as possible, but without failure. Because when they start to experience too much failure, they experience anxiety. And when they start, if you make it too easy and we're not challenging them enough, then they experience boredom. And we want them to be, we don't want them to experience either of those things. So instead, what we do in our facilitations is we produce a flow state stimulation. And when applied in the context of uninterrupted constant engagement of peak performance activity, as is the case with the primary composition, the stimulation of a flow state becomes inevitable and the outcomes of the learning curve begin to resemble exponential growth instead. And this is what we mean, going back to the first slide about flow state, is when we say the person's resistance to the sensory information of their environment becomes harmonized. Because we notice this a lot in our facilitations. We push the zone of proximal development, we push it, we push it, we push it, and you start to feel the person get really anxious, and you feel the energy, the tenseness in their body. You see the tenseness in their body, and then you reach a breaking point where something clicks and they stop to resist. And all of their energy in an instant transforms to completely harmonized. And we see this pattern of behavior over and over and over again with the primary composition. So we take the idea of the zone of proximal development and we use the combination, because when we challenge someone to the point of failure, it provokes fear, it provokes adrenaline. So by pushing them to their limit, we flood their brain with adrenaline because they always have this sense of they're about to fail. But also because I'm facilitated, I'm in control. I never create a challenge that they cannot achieve. So they always get a sense of accomplishment at the same time. So we're also flooding their brain with dopamine. We combine adrenaline and dopamine peak performance activity for an extended period of time, and you have a flow state. That's it. From the start, because I don't know what time I started. In 40 minutes, 40 minutos. I get my time more than 40 minutes. Gracias. I think this is like a really sort of strange thing to understand at first. And you have to, I think you have to see it to believe it. It's one of those things, I think part of the theories where people are like, okay, you're claiming to do something crazy, like, and people don't often believe it. But when you facilitate and you become aware of this nonverbal communication is when you become aware of just, not just for juggling how much potential we have, but just for play in general. Like if we're more aware of these nonverbal learning strategies, just how much more impactful we can be. So the next thing to talk about is the Propswap notation. And again, this is just, I'm just going to sort of explain like the idea of it, because it's we use this to create the composition. We need a notation system to create our composition. And it's the composition where we use our facilitation strategies. So this is not an introduction to Propswap, but the overview is that Propswap is an ordered system of notation that allows us to describe the different sequencing activities of functional juggling. It does derive its grammatical influence from the classical model of site swap notation. So basically what I did was I just took the grammar structure of site swap and I applied it to a different system where instead of using numbers to indicate periods of time, I use numbers and letters to indicate positions within the spatial sequencing map. That's it. So if you do understand both systems, it doesn't help you. Sometimes it confuses people more. And sometimes it helps them. I haven't seen whether, I can't say whether it's better or worse. So in general, site swap seeks to calculate the order of events in time, whereas Propswap acts to identify the locations of events in space. And this is a notation system that's intended to create a universal language of communication so that all facilitators, we can have one universal language no matter what language we speak, and I can then write a composition and I can encourage you. Because there's also different compositions that we use dependent on our audience. And the idea is to give everyone the primary composition first and have you practice and that as your model of what to imitate. And then to encourage you, dependent on your audience, to create your own compositions, which are intended to achieve certain goals, right? The primary composition is the primary composition because it's intended to achieve every goal at the same time. But you might be working in a situation where specifically with a particular group of people that have a certain need. And we want to encourage you to create your own compositions for that audience and then to share those compositions with our community, right? So that's the benefit. That's why it's important that we all learn this. It's a little bit of annoying at the beginning, but once you have it, it makes a world of difference. You can access so much more information. So as I said, the general idea is we apply the spatial sequencing maps to our, oh, lo siento. Can you hear that in the background? Okay, this is Latin America. Maybe I need to take a pause. It's not over. But it's good. I need to breathe. I'm presenting, pretty hard right now. Bendigus, you can edit this out later. Little cultural lesson for people who are not from Latin America, but it's very common practice to drive around the streets with a megaphone on the back of your truck, just announcing anything you want. It could be a birthday party. It could be somebody trying to sell things. But you're allowed to do that here. So that's what that was. That wasn't a public notice or anything. La vida. Okay. Ready? I'm ready. Okay, so the general idea is that we take the spatial sequencing maps and we apply either numbers or letters, and then the way we organize those letters is how we understand how we should interact with them. So for forward arrangements, we use the numbers, and then for horizontal arrangements, we use the letters. And this allows us to just, what that does is it allows us to use the same system of notation without having to indicate the different form of interaction, because we use the same system for both structures. We just change the notation, the integers. So Readng notation follows the same principle as reading a timeline, because the order in which its integers appear is the same order in which they occur in time. So you see a number 2, it means I interact with the 2 location. I see a number 4, I interact with the 4 location. So the order they appear is the order that I interact with them. And it always, the important thing to understand is the same rule from site swap notation, is that the time always alternates sides. It doesn't matter which hand I start with, but I always have to alternate. Time always alternates sides. That's the one rule to remember. So an example notation would be 2, 3. And in this example, it would go 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, like this. And then in the other example, so 2, 3, it's an even period. So my hands never change locations. The left is always the 2, the right is always the 3. But if I have an odd period, for example, 2, 3, 1, then it would be 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Anytime there's an odd period notation, it means that it's going to have to cycle through twice before it completes all of its locations. And this is helpful information when we're constructing our compositions. There's 3 forms of interaction that exist within this system of notation for now. There are communities who want to expand this, and there is a need to expand this, but this is the basis of the interactions we're able to notate at this point with this system. And the first one is a fixed state interaction, which represents a form of relationship with orbital events in which the pathways through space are arranged directly in between 2 points. I know I explain things complicated all the time, but that basically means, what that basically means is the objects, they don't change their locations in space. They move back and forth in a straight line between 2 points. And then open state is when they move in more of a classical orbital structure, when they change their location. So their way back to their beginning is not the same way that they left. So a fixed state, it returns the same way it went out. An orbital state, it comes back a different way that it left. And then a mixed state is the combination of those 2, to do some combination of those 2, which creates what we call disassociated. And I didn't cover that in the review, but in the last seminar, we talked about disassociated states, which is also part of the theory of process formations. And disassociated states is just when we're not using the same motor control movement on either side. So the theory of process formations, it really just focuses on associated. It assumes that every movement is the same. And the reason we don't focus on the disassociated is because it's so easy to make those transformations. If you understand the relationships with space and time and how to create, then it's just a matter of changing the object or changing the movement. So we don't feel the need to emphasize this part of the theory. Can you see this video? Oh no, I have the wheel of death. Come on. Oh, I missed, this is open state. I missed the last one, it passed it. Okay, here we go. So this is an example of a fixed state activity. It just means the objects move back and forth. And at the top, if you look at the notation, this pattern is 4325. Whenever we use synchronous, we put in parentheses and we read it as a whole number, as opposed to individually, as opposed to 4325. 4325 would be the asynchronous version of this pattern. And now I have to be patient. Okay, and now we have the open state. So open state is when the objects change their location. So it leaves in one location and it comes back in another location. And for this at the top, if you see the notation, the first numbers are to show you where the ball arrives, and the second number is to show you where the ball leaves. I'm having some computer problems, I apologize. This is mixed state activity. The notation for this is a lot more complicated, or it looks a lot more complicated, as you can see, but it's really just a combination of the two systems. So once you understand both systems, that notation will make sense to you. But you can see this is disassociated because on the one side of the body, you're having a fixed state interaction with space. And on the other side of the body, you're having an open state interaction with space. So it's causing your brain to have to use two different signals to process both of those interactions, which causes like the opposite effect of all the other, you know, with the other conditions, we're encouraging bilateral communication. And here we are as well. But now each side of the brain has to be more accurate with how it communicates its information because the signals are not the same. So they can interfere with each other more. And this is why you see people get sort of confused when they try disassociated activities. They sort of freak out and pause. They pause their bodies because the information interferes. And here's an example of the notational transformation. So basically, when we're doing the composition, we're really only working with 5 basic patterns. And each of these patterns is intended to stimulate a different relationship with space and time. It's to develop a different relationship with, mostly with space, the structure of our interaction. And then we have, what we do is we take those 5 patterns and we apply the theory of process formations to create transformations. And this is how that notation works. So if you see in pattern 1, synchronous lateral would be 2345, asynchronous lateral would be 2345, synchronous bilateral would be crossing 23 and 45, and so on. And what this does is it allows me to take one pattern and use that, transform that pattern to develop all 4 sequencing relationships of the theory of process formations. And when we structure the composition, we basically just take them through all of the examples for synchronous lateral. So they're introduced to all of these relationships with space first. Then we go back through and we introduce them to the same relationships, but asynchronous. Then we go back through and we introduce them to the same relationships, but asynchronous but synchronous bilateral, and then asynchronous bilateral. So we develop them in layers, and we know that every step of the way we are exposing them to all of the possible sequencing relationships they will need to have. So it's a very efficient way to develop their capacities once you begin to apply this theory. So the primary composition. The primary composition is a radically effective means of developing a person's sequencing capacity well beyond what is required to manage the expression of a 3-ball tossing cascade. It takes the theory of process formations and applies its transformations to the systematic capacity development of each of its participants' experience. It is intended, but not required, to be facilitated non-verbally and with as little interruption to engagement as possible. Emphasis of social and emotional learning experience is critical to the management of consistent, successful outcomes. So going back through that, I already explained to you how, we're taking the theory of process formations, we're applying that to the idea of notation and sequencing maps to create a composition that is intended to have the most natural learning process possible. In addition to that, that's the technical side. The delivery side is the half of the equation, so just having that material itself gives us a lot more access, but being able to guarantee its success, we have to learn some new facilitation models. And that's what I mean by the emphasis of learning is more social and emotional. So let's get into some of those. So first I'm going to show you a video of the different parts of the primary composition. So there's 3 parts to it. There's the fixed state, there's the open state, and then there's the horizontal. And right now I'm just going to allow everyone watch based off, if this is your first time hearing this information, maybe it's not going to be so clear, but try to watch the composition now, reflecting on relationships with space and time, and looking at the differences between the transitions between the synchronous lateral, asynchronous lateral, looking at the transformations of the theory of process formations. Try to be aware of that. Or I guess I could just talk while I do this too. Wow, that's amazing. It's like having an assistant. Technology. There you go. So this is pattern 2. And in pattern 2, it's causing the person's midline to change sides. So here it's the left hand on the red ball, and then it's the right hand. It's synchronous, but the hand that contacts the midline is forced to change sides. And then this is pattern 4 now, and here this hand is crossing the midline. And then we go back through, we're conditioning. I'm getting repetition because I'm using the same patterns, but I keep changing them. So I'm able to get the person to get a lot of repetition and time on task. And during this stage of interaction, I'm conditioning their relationships with space first. Now you see that I transition to asynchronous. These locations that the participant is interacting with, they already have experience interacting with these locations and this sequence in space. What they didn't have experience doing was separating the timing of that sequence. So I present them now with the same exact sequences from before, but I separate the timing. And I develop it in a way where I get them to sequence the highest level of the theory of process formations. So this is pattern 5 now. This is the goal of this development process. That's the ultimate outcome, because there the person is asynchronous, they're alternating between asynchronous bilateral and asynchronous lateral within one sequence. Then we transition, this is introducing the synchronous bilateral. This is the movement that we use. We're going to talk about how we communicate these, but it's typically done through gesture and sound. There are a few moments in the composition where we need to communicate to our participant a certain behavior. But because we use so much mimicking strategy throughout the whole thing, they're constantly getting this sensory input from us through the contact of the objects. When you use sound and gesture in this setting, the person responds very effectively. So we're also, because of the system of play that we're using, it's encouraging us to use, mirror and communication strategies as well. And so then I transition them back through, and it's the same idea. And then we finish back on pattern 5. This is the open state part of the composition now. So what you start to see is you start to see a lot of repetition. So it's about conditioning this relationship with space first. Here, we're using synchronous lateral because I want to condition the participant's relationship with space first. After I have that behavior, then I'm going to separate the timing of that space to asynchronous, like you see that happens now. And the person without pause responds because they're responding to this tactile sensory influence. Because they have rhythm, when you construct the rhythm, you get an impulse to move. So that there's an impulse, there's an unintentional impulse to move, and they're responding to the sensory feedback information. That's what's encouraging them to do this. This is the same way dance works. When we respond to the rhythm, we harmonize the processing. Okay, and then this is the final part of the composition, which is just to give them independence. At this stage of the primary composition, we've guaranteed that the student has more than enough sequencing capacity to do all of the tasks of the solo independent. The only thing we need to learn to manage here is the emotional self-regulation, because the person has the sequencing capacity at this stage. But at this point, prior to this, we were giving them the balls, so we were able to alternate their sensory feedback information. Here, we can't do that. If they make a mistake, that sensory feedback, they're influenced by their own negative sensory feedback. So what ends up happening is they'll start calm at the beginning, and over a short period of time, they'll get very excited and they'll get overstimulated. So the main focus in this part, we have other strategies for how to help people feel more relaxed with this stage of the learning. But at this point of the composition, if they are struggling, if they completed the previous part of the composition and they are having a hard time making this transition, it is completely emotional and social. It's not about their sequencing capacity because we've already exceeded that development level. So there are a few facilitation techniques that we use in the primary composition because we are presented with very common mistakes, you know, that a lot of people have the same challenges. And we've observed this through so much trial and error. And one of the strategies we have is, or one of the first challenges we have is when making the transition from synchronous to asynchronous, because it's a really big jump. It's a lot bigger jump than you think. And it's in terms of how many tasks that need to be processed. So it's very common for someone to make a mistake. They won't respond. They won't do the asynchronous. You'll give them the asynchronous information, but they'll respond synchronous, or they'll use the same hand twice to deal with the input. Rather than change hands every time, they'll use the same hand. They'll prioritize the space instead of the time. And if you watch this video, here, if you watch the participant is using the same hand for each side, right, right, left, left. Watch your hands, same hand, other hand, other hand. Whereas the facilitator on the other side keeps changing hands. I'm doing left, right, left, right. The hands that are black are the hands that are making the mistake here. The hands with the black sleeves are the incorrect ones. So this is a very common response when you give someone asynchronous timing for the first time. They prioritize the space over the time. So we use a technique called packeting. And by that, what we mean is we return to the synchronous condition of the same pattern. So this pattern I want the person to do, I'm now going to switch to doing synchronous instead. So I can condition her relationship with space first. And then from there, I gradually transition the timing from synchronous to asynchronous. I don't jump from synchronous to asynchronous. I give a beat, bump, 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 bump. So we build up the tempo in a more gradual way instead of asking the person to jump from one frequency to another. Okay, so here's the same pattern now. This is pattern 4. If the person doesn't respond to the asynchronous information, I go back to synchronous, and then I give a small separation of time. And it's very common when I start to separate the timing of those events, they'll continue to give me synchronous. But if I continue to give them a different piece of information, the longer I continue to give them that information, they keep getting the sensory feedback information, they will begin to mimic my behavior. Their timing will change as well. You just have to be patient. It's a strategy you need to learn to practice with patience, because you have to have the confidence that they're going to adjust. So you just have to present them with the information and give them the time to learn. That's it. That's why I don't have to talk. Do you want to see this video again? It didn't loop. Let's watch that one more time. So it's synchronous, condition the relationship with space, and then start to separate the information gradually. Bump, 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 bump. This is the same way you would teach someone a new dance, no? If you had a dance partner and they didn't know the dance, what would you do? You would break down the steps with them, and then you would build up the tempo, right? It's the same thing. So gesture and sound. Gesture and sound are the two forms of communication that we will use during our facilitation, because the idea is, another part of the idea is we don't want to use verbal communication, whether the person can process verbally or not. We want to avoid it, because anytime you start to use verbal communication to explain things is when you start to create an expectation of the outcome for that thing, and then you take the person out of a state of play. And the state of play is the best place to learn. So we don't want our students to become aware of any expectation. We don't want to give them information to process. We want to give them feedback to respond to. So gesture and sound is another form of feedback in this situation. And the things we use point in. You can use, a lot of people like to use sound effects because it makes it more fun. So maybe one ball I'll have one sound for, like beep, and another ball I'll have another sound for, like bop. And we go beep, bop, beep, bop. It's also very helpful to have music on in the room at the same time. And if you have music playing, you will find that the person will harmonize their rhythms with the interactions with the balls to the frequency of the music that's in the background as well. That will happen organically, which is why I encourage facilitators to practice at the beginning without music, because I want you to be more aware of the physical information instead of the audio, and then to combine the two strategies later on. But when you practice and you train, try with music and without, and you'll notice the difference. You have other sensory feedback to harmonize with in that situation, which can make it easier. And that's sort of the idea of gesture and sound, just to give more sensory influence of what the person's behavior should be, more context to their own behavior. This has a lot to do with the psychology of learning, because as soon as we communicate the intention of an activity, we also create an expectation for its performance as well. That creates anxiety, adrenaline. It takes the person out of the process of learning. Learning occurs best when it takes place in an environment of play, and this is the intention of our facilitation. So here's an example of gesture and sound.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom, pa, boom, pa. Tickety, tackety, tickety, tackety.
So sometimes it can happen that a person's not really responding, or they're not really understanding the intuitive nature of this system of play. You know, perhaps they're self-conscious or whatever, but they're not receiving the play so well. I find that the gesture can help them, you know, begin to engage, and I scaffold it. I begin with a lot of support to help them know what to do. People who are looking for more guidance, I don't tell them, if someone says, what should I do? I don't explain to them, oh, you need to roll the ball back to me. I'll start to use gesture and sound to help them begin to engage. And then once they start to play, I take it away, and then we just keep playing. I never explain to them the system. They just needed a little bit of help to come in. I didn't have to explain it to them. So during delivery of the primary composition, there are 2 moments of this interaction in which the frequency of engagement must be interrupted in order to communicate the next stage of its behavior. This occurs for the first time during the introduction of synchronous bilateral activity, as the crossing and uncrossing of arms is a slightly more complex relationship to explain without the use of gesture. So when we introduce synchronous bilateral for the first time, we have a quick pause in our composition. I have to pause because I need to show them, I want them to change their behavior. But the goal is to keep this pause as short as possible, because we don't want to lose the stimulation. And it's very effortless because they've harmonized with us already. It's that people respond so well to the gesture. You just have to make sure that you go slow and you make your movement really big and intentional. If you're slow and intentional, then they will understand. And here's an example of the behavior that we want to show, we want them to do. So this is the new behavior I want them to do. And then that. It should be playing, it's a little bit slow. So I start with just 2 objects, just 2 balls, just to condition the behavior. And then once I see that the person is responding to that behavior on their own, then I begin the rest of the composition. Once they've shown me that they've accepted the new behavior, then I start the rest of the composition. So that's how we use gesture and sound to communicate synchronous bilateral. Facilitation techniques, gesture and sound. And then the second time that we have to stop the primary composition is when we introduce the open state. So when we're introducing the new behavior of changing objects' locations, because before we just roll directly, and we do that first because it's the most intuitive. You roll someone a ball, 90% of people will roll it back to you intuitively. The other 10% will pick it up and throw it or take it someplace else. So we need to communicate to them what we want them to do in this series. And the video should be playing. Here it goes. So there's many different models you can do here. Sometimes you have to sort of stop the people's hands, but in general, all you got to do is show the person. And when you facilitate this way too, you'll see so much responsiveness. Like as soon as I start to move my hands as soon as the balls stop, the person is looking at you and you have all of their attention, and they're looking at you and then they're looking at their hands and they're trying to figure out what to do. They understand the system of play now. They're not waiting for explanations anymore. They're very actively searching for their own solution. So you get so much responsiveness from your students in this style of communication. Another thing, when we make the transition to the independent, like I said before, the idea of the 2 first parts of the primary composition is to exceed the sequence challenge of what they're going to be asked to do on their own. so that we know that the only thing left to deal with is emotional. Making sure that they have the ability to self-regulate their own sensory feedback information. That's the last step. So when transitioning from forward arrangements to horizontal arrangements, though, we lose the ability to communicate directly with the tactile sensory feedback information. So because of this, we need to start to look for other forms of communication strategies that can replace this physical communication. And for that, we create a system of play. We use it as a transition between the first two parts of the composition and the final part of the composition. This section is not always required. It depends who you're working with. But we do find that in general, it's always helpful to play these games before you ask the person to be independent. Because the idea of the games, is to do two things. It's to develop them for the next step, like with sequencing capacities. But more importantly, it's to transfer the communication strategies that we had on the juggle board to be more social and more personal. So to take all those relationships I built with this nonverbal communication strategy and make it more personal now. 10 minutos es una hora? 1. Perfect. I'm doing good on time. So one of the ways to do this is to structure a system of play that we refer to as solo social activity, which is intended to strengthen the social and emotional bonds between a facilitator and their participant. And we do this at this moment because we're losing the ability to communicate with them tactile. So here's the demonstration. So the idea of the activity is to, okay, so we start off by rolling a ball back and forth. And in the same way that we harmonize our frequency with the participant at the beginning when we're exchanging the balls, I do the same thing now. I watch the student roll and I make sure that my ball is a mirror of their ball, because that's going to encourage them to mirror me back. So I harmonize my motion with my ball to be the same as theirs. And then I change my motion and they copy me back. Does that make sense? The other thing you're seeing here in the first video, if you watch closely, I use a system of movements with my hands. I reach my hand into her zone first and I put it low because the person is always looking at their ball. They're not looking at me yet. They're looking at their ball. So I place my hand in their field of vision down low and I get them to interact with me. This is my point of contact. I take back the tactile communication. And then once I have that response, I bring my hands up towards my face. And once I'm making contact with the hands here, then they look me in the eyes. And from there, I have complete control. Any gesture I suggest now, they will copy. And any gesture they suggest to me, I will copy back as well so that I can show them the communication strategy works in both directions. So this is an activity that it helps a lot nonverbal people like working with autism, especially because there's so much repetition with this communication strategy as well. So if you work with a child who's nonverbal, playing these types of games with them, you can help condition this mirror communication strategy, which is very transferable if I'm in another set and I want to communicate something like with a gesture. Like if I want to know if you're thirsty now, I can use gesture to let you know I'm communicating something, right? So there's a lot of outside benefits to this form of teaching. Another way we like to do it is with a ring. So this is where we start to introduce more functional, because we have an empty beat in our hand. So when we start to replace the objects, we can start to encourage different types of movements. And this is a game that I love to play with my students. I like to use the arrow because if I make them contact the arrow, I can determine where their arm is in space and also what is the orientation of their wrist in relationship to that position. So if I want their hand here, I turn and they tap. So I'm just getting every position that I want. I go through, I cycle, and they don't think, they just respond. And it's play. And it's really encouraged to strengthen not strengthen, but transition the emotional relationships we created with the tactile communication to be more personal. Because I find that allows me to help keep the person calm in the next stage of development, which is for them to be independent. So here are some other variations. What's beautiful about this activity is it's endless for its creative potential. You need one ball to roll back and forth and another object to pass. And kids will play with this forever because it's all about being creative. As soon as you come up with one thing, you come up with another one. And then you replace the objects. And when you replace the objects, like you see in the video on the other side here, I have a clock, Jael has a ukulele. Now you're getting repetition and time on task with functional objects. So really classic examples is to have a pen instead of, pass a pen back and forth, pass a cup back and forth, pass something functional and do a functional motion with that object at the same time. So this solo social play activity is another place where we start to introduce functionality into functional juggling. And in that context, really what we're focused on is time on task and repetition with very particular functional movements. And we're just incorporating that functional movement into our existing system of play. That's how easy it is. So you can take these games and you can go to a clinical center and you can say, what movement do you want your participants to have? And then you show them, I can get you thousands of repetition. And I can make it very fun and socially engaging. That's what we have to share. Facilitation in the support independence. Okay, so the ability to experience juggling independently is the ultimate goal of every facilitation and the culminating challenge of our primary composition. By the time students reach this level of their facilitation, they have already been prepared for all of the sequence and challenges which are about to come next. The difference in this situation is that participants are now required to manage all of the influences of sensory feedback information on their own, as I said before. And it's when they start to give themselves the sensory feedback, there's no regulation there. So that input gets amplified. If they make a mistake and there's intensity there, they're harmonized. So that side of the brain is going to mimic back the frequency that it receives. And that's why you see this sort of crescendo, this buildup of over sensory stimulation. It starts slow and it goes faster, 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 and it collapses. And this has a tendency to lead to large levels of stress and hyperactivity. So we have a few solutions for this. We do have good solutions for this. 3 good ones. So the best way to support this period of adjustment is to encourage students to stay calm and take their time in learning to process each step of the way. So in most cases, I start off by just using gesture and sound to help them. I try to do the least amount of intervention as possible at this stage as I can. I want them to learn independently. So the first example shows you what happens. This video is showing you what you might expect when you make this transition. Somebody goes from a very calm, collected, connected person to being a very manic, terrified human being because of the over-sensory stimulation. So one of the first strategies we have for that is to use gesture and sound. And because of the relationship I previously formed with them, so again, I use that same strategy of I come in with a lot of support and structure and I gradually pull away. So it's like, for me, this is equivalent to when you're pushing the child, you're holding the seat for the unicycle. You know, the child's riding the unicycle and you're holding the seat and then you let go. So that you transition from a supported system of learning to an independent system of learning without any gap. That's the idea. That's what the juggle board allows us to do in developing the juggling capacities. We can transition without any gaps. In some extreme situations, when participants exhibit particularly high levels of anxiety, it is a good idea to engage them in one of the following sensory activities. So the first one is absence of vision, or the 3 are absence of vision, static sequencing strategies, or inclined surface play. So in the top corner, you see the first example. This is static. So if the person is showing a lot of anxiety, make them do this activity. Force them to let the balls come to a stop, because when the balls come to a stop, they no longer receive the sensory feedback information about them. So they're able to process the sequence without having to deal with the sensory stimulation first, and then they can gradually develop more into an independent state of sequencing. So to watch that video again, in this situation, we encourage the sensory information to go away, because the sensory information is what's causing the overstimulation, right? In the second example, we have the inclined plane. And here, now you're causing the student to have to communicate with the sensory information of space and time. If they roll the ball hard, the information they get back is the information of gravity. And the information of gravity is the information of space and time. So it's a way for them to develop, because here it forces you, it gives you another source of information to harmonize. In order for this activity to work, you have to be aware of what it's telling you. And then the last one is to do the exercise blind with the eyes closed. I think I pushed the button. In the bottom corner, you see with the eyes closed. And this is a really great activity. I encourage you, if you have a juggle board, to play with this, because you as a facilitator, if you play this way, you'll become so much more aware of how much information you have. If you really start to learn to listen to the tactile information, we can gain a lot of information about what our students are, not just how they're performing, but also how they're feeling. So those are the two things we need as educators, right? How is my student feeling and how are they performing? Check. I think I'm coming to the end here, getting close. It's just really slow. I think I have, okay, conclusion, yeah. Facilitation technique conclusions. Functional juggling uses sensory integrated facilitation techniques in order to be able to influence, guide, and process the learning experience of others. Peros. Managing facilitation in this way allows us to stimulate maximum levels of performance, but without the risk of failure. Prolonged periods of engagement with this type of experience is a key component of producing flow states or states of flow, as we said before. Compositions and notations are used to choreograph effective learning progressions prior to facilitation. Learning to develop a sensory relationship with juggling is an emotional experience, right? This is the main thing we need to understand, that it is an emotional experience. Developing a relationship with juggling is an emotional experience. I think that's something in our community is still a new idea, but with music and dance, we already know this. Developing a relationship with music and dance is an emotional experience. So we need to approach juggling this way as well, because they are essentially the same thing. Taking the time to be aware of such obstacles and designing sensory appropriate exercises is equally, if not more important than focusing on the development of technique. And this is the big takeaway from everything that I create, is that it's sort of ironic. If you approach teaching with an obsession of its outcome for the technique, when you put the value on the actual thing you're teaching, you end up getting lower results than if you put the value on the personal well-being of the person. What is their learning process, not what is their learning outcome. And functional juggling allows us to present juggling in a way where each person is able to engage it with their own level of learning process. Everyone is responsible for their own level. We are just the guides in this context. I present you with the opportunity to learn, and you learn that on your own. That's the only job. And we have to learn as facilitators, how to regulate the zone of proximal development. And these are things you'll learn and you'll practice. You'll see, oh, I pushed, that student was doing really well, and then something went wrong. What went wrong? Oh, I pushed them too hard. I accelerated the learning curve too much, and I lost them. Or in other situations, you'll see where the person is too soft. Like, you all now, this is a foundation for you. I opened a door, right? Like, it's to give you a new platform to communicate, a new platform to explore how to educate, how to develop your relationships with your students, and what learning potentials we can squeeze out of that. Thank you for participating in today's presentation. We hope it was of value to you. At this point, I need to take a 5-minute pause because I've been talking and thinking very fast for a long time, and I would like to take a drink of water. So I'm going to stop the screen share now, and I'm going to pass it back to Veronika, and she can speak a little bit about the 3C project and some upcoming things. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you, Craig.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
I will be
a
back.
lot.
I will be back for the Q&A. I will be back for the Q&A.
And this is actually the official end. So if you're still alive, because I know that Craig is like to listen to this this topic for more than an hour, and especially if you haven't used juggle board at all in your life, it could be heavy. So it's congratulations to everybody who's still alive.